With us now, NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli, Betsy Woodruff Swan, political national correspondent for Politico and an MSNBC contributor, and Barbara McQuade, former U.S. attorney who is now a law professor at the University of Michigan. She is also an MSNBC legal analyst. So, Mike, the president insisted for months that he would not pardon his son. What changed his mind?
Well, Jose, one of the most important pieces of the reporting that first broke this story from our colleagues Carol Lee and Sarah Fitzpatrick was to point out that after Hunter Biden was first convicted in that Delaware trial on gun-related charges in June, the president and his team had not taken this idea of a pardon off the table, even as publicly, you just played some of that, the president himself, the White House press secretary, and I spoke with First Lady Jill Biden in June and asked her about this idea of a pardon, whether she wished her husband could use that power to take the burden off her son. She said that she and her husband respect the rule of law. So it's clear that this has been something that they have been considering despite those public denials, but I think it's clear as well that the election in November certainly influenced the president's thinking here. At least as far as it relates to the breadth of that pardon. You see the pictures. I was with the president in Nantucket over the last week. It was a place rich with significance to the president and his family. He's been going there for nearly half a century with his family at this holiday season. And it's the most extensive time that the president has had one-on-one with his son since the election. And I think the fear over what a Trump-led Justice Department might do in terms of broadening the scope of investigations, which have been limited thus far to the gun-related charges as well as tax charges in Los Angeles, I think was a concern of theirs. Now, Jose, I'll point out to you, I'm listening to you in my right ear. In my left ear, I'm listening right now to a gaggle happening with Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, on Air Force One. She's literally being asked as we speak, as I speak, for the first time about her public denials. And so I'll take a listen to that and get back to you here in a moment with any of the new reaction we're getting from the White House.
That's great. Thanks. Really appreciate that. You do that. Betsy, meanwhile, you wrote Hunter Biden's pardon looks a lot like Richard Nixon's. How so?
That's right. The only pardon that multiple pardon experts I spoke to that looks significantly like Hunter's is the pardon that Gerald Ford gave to Richard Nixon after he resigned as president. That's because both the Nixon pardon and Hunter Biden's pardon don't limit the pardon to a specific crime. In the case of Nixon, of course, he hadn't been subject to any sort of criminal indictment or criminal charges when Ford pardoned him. And Ford's pardon covered anything Nixon did during the 4 years he was president, regardless of what investigators could have turned up, regardless of what crimes he potentially could have been charged with. Similarly, Hunter Biden's pardon is deliberately vague. It deliberately covers all conduct from 2014 up until present day, more than a decade, including not just the conduct for which Hunter Biden has pleaded guilty and been convicted by a jury, but anything else. It's an extraordinary level of protection. And even though Trump himself, of course, took a very creative, aggressive and expansive view of the presidential pardon power, he himself never actually gave anyone carte blanche. He never gave someone a pardon that covered unspecified activity, uncharged activity, any activity within a certain period of time. And now the expectation is, since President Biden has crossed that Rubicon, basically giving his son the same type of treatment that Ford gave to Nixon, now the expectation is that when Trump returns to the White House, he's more likely not just to issue controversial pardons, but to issue extremely broad pardons in the same vein as the one the president just issued. And Trump, of course, will be able to point to the Hunter Biden pardon if he decides to take that move.
Yeah, Barbara, I mean, a broad pardon like the one that the president set out to announce last night, that includes anything and everything, right? Any level of crime?
Well, any federal crime dating back to 2014. And I think although this is unusual, it covers really kind of three buckets of conduct here. The gun charge, which in my experience is not a charge that would have been filed against any other defendant. I can recall in my 20 years as a prosecutor filing that charge exactly once, and it was against someone who was very dangerous that we wanted to get off the streets. The second bucket is the tax charges. Hunter Biden entered a guilty plea to those things, but it was all for unpaid taxes for which he'd already repaid the taxes, the interest, and the penalties. That is not the kind of case for which a prosecutor would ordinarily use their scarce federal resources. It would be handled civilly, and that would be the end of it. So those two, really, this pardon makes a lot of sense to me. The other, for everything else, I think comes in a response to Donald Trump's pledge to use the Justice Department to exact retribution against his political rivals. We know that there have been suggestions that Hunter Biden relied on his father's name to get a board position with Burisma. There have been allegations of misconduct relating to Ukraine and China. I'll note that despite vigorous investigations, both in Congress and by the special counsel, no crimes were ever found, despite a great effort to find them. But perhaps Joe Biden thought it was necessary to protect his son from those promises of retribution.
Yeah, I mean, Barbara, on that note, the president wrote in that statement that, quote, no reasonable person who looks at the facts of Hunter's cases can reach any other conclusion that Hunter was singled out only because he is my son, and that is wrong. In effect, is the president making the case that the DOJ is politicized, that it was going after selective prosecution?
I think he is. I think he is suggesting that the gun case and the tax case would not have been brought against an ordinary American. I think the case began with an effort to look for more serious crimes. Even the way David Weiss, the special counsel, tried to initially resolve this case suggests that even he found it to be not a tremendously important case. Remember that he offered a plea to no prison time, pretrial diversion for the gun, and a misdemeanor on the tax case. It was only after that plea deal fell apart that they went and filed indictments for felonies in both of these cases. So I think that's exactly what Joe Biden is saying, that Hunter Biden was singled out, treated differently because of politics, and that he has the power to end it. So he's going to do that to protect his son.
Hey, Mike, just wondering if you're listening to anything that has been referenced by the presidential spokesperson about this issue and not. And also, so let me just start with you. Anything? Has she said anything on it?
Well, Jose, I've been listening just in these last 3 minutes to a very animated back and forth between the reporters traveling with the president to Angola on Air Force One right now with Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary. For the most part, Jean-Pierre is referring simply to the text of the statement from the president last night, emphasizing that he made this decision over the last week while with his son in Nantucket, that, as Karine Jean-Pierre said, he made this decision himself. But what I find also interesting is that she is pointing to some of the defenses of this decision from the likes of former Attorney General Eric Holder and the kind of argument that was laid out by Abbe Lowell, Hunter Biden's lead attorney, in terms of the way in which they view Hunter Biden has been prosecuted only because he is the president's son, that the severity of the charges that were brought against him would not have been brought against him had his name been Hunter Smith. And so what's interesting about that, Jose, is that has not been something we heard directly from the president or from the White House in the last 6 months. It had largely been an argument that was left to the president and Hunter Biden's allies. And so for now, after this pardon decision has been made, for the White House itself to adopt those arguments about the fact that they feel the justice system in some ways was tilted against Hunter Biden, I think is a noteworthy development that speaks to the whiplash that many are feeling at this moment, considering the denials that we've been hearing consistently from the president and his team up to this point.
And Betsy, any thoughts on how this will be seen by historians? What do you think this could do to the president's legacy?
Undoubtedly, historians will look at this pardon and say that for many, many months, the president and the people at the highest levels of the White House were not telling the truth about his view of this prosecution of his son. That's going to be a coda to every single historical reference to this pardon, not just controversy about the substance of the pardon, but raising really serious and grave questions about the White House's honesty regarding the president's thinking. Of course, the White House press secretary can say whatever they like to try to make it sound like they were totally honest, totally forthcoming. I find it very doubtful that people are going to buy that. There's one other really important difference here between the pardon that Biden handed down for Hunter and the pre-Trump norm for presidential pardons. From about 1950 through just up until the Trump administration, it was very, very, very unusual for presidents to justify pardons by arguing that the criminal justice system had engaged in unfairness. Rather, presidents basically issued pardons in the frame of this person's done the wrong thing. They've paid their debt to society, and now we're giving them forgiveness. Trump, of course, blowtorched that norm. And in many of the pardons that he issued, he said that the people he was pardoning were victims and had been treated unfairly. Biden, of course, returned to the White House on the promise of restoring norms. But in bringing forward this pardon of his son by arguing his son was a victim of a miscarriage of justice, he's actually continuing down the road that Trump very much opened up in using the extraordinary platform of the White House to accuse the criminal justice system of treating someone in a way that was unfair. And what this is going to do immediately, what's already started, is it's going to result in a ton of pressure from criminal justice reform advocates, as well as from senators on President Biden to issue more pardons and more grants of executive clemency to people who they believe are also being treated unfairly, notably drug offenders, nonviolent drug offenders who are serving extraordinarily long federal prison sentences. What advocates are going to say is, okay, President Biden, you believe your son was treated unfairly and he merited a pardon. What about these hundreds, if not thousands, of other federal prisoners who we believe are also being treated unfairly? But of course, you don't have the opportunity to eat Thanksgiving dinner with the president. Shouldn't those people also receive some sort of grace, some sort of clemency?